In 1967, the United States Secretary of Defense commissioned a secret study, 7,000 pages, classified top secret, produced by the Pentagon's own analysts. People with access to every field report, every intelligence intercept, every strategic decision made since the beginning of the conflict. The stated objective was simple: to document with complete honesty how the United States had entered the Vietnam War and what was really happening inside it. And when the study was finished, the conclusion was so devastating that the very man who commissioned it locked it in a drawer. He did not hand it to Congress. He did not hand it to the president. He did not hand it to the public. He simply left the government, went to work at the World Bank, and left 7,000 pages of truth rotting in classified files. Because what those pages revealed was not simply that the war was being lost. It was something far worse than that. It was that the people in power had known this from the beginning. They knew the strategies were not working. They knew the progress numbers being released to the press were fabricated. They knew the enemy was not weakening. And they continued anyway, sending 19-year-olds to die in a jungle on the other side of the world for consecutive presidents. 2 decades of conflict. More than 58,000 Americans dead. More than 2 million Vietnamese civilians dead. And at some point during all of it, in closed meetings, in secret recordings, in diplomatic cables no one was supposed to see, the people responsible were admitting to each other that there was no way out. That study only became public in 1971, when a defense analyst named Daniel Ellsberg did something few men would have had the courage to do. He photocopied all 7,000 pages, one by one, and handed them to the newspapers. The American government went immediately to court to block publication. The case reached the Supreme Court in record time, and when the court ruled that the newspapers had the right to publish, what the world read on the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post was documentary proof of one of the greatest institutional betrayals of the 20th century. But here is the detail that most people do not know, and that changes everything. The publication of the Pentagon Papers did not end the war. The war continued for 4 more years after that, because the truth on its own was never enough to stop what had been set in motion. This is the story of how all of it happened, where it began, who made the decisions, what each of them knew, and what they chose to hide, and why. Half a century later, it still matters to understand every detail of what was done in the name of a war that should never have lasted this long. If you want to understand stories like this one, where power operates in the shadows while ordinary people pay the price, subscribe to the channel right now. What we cover here is not the version they teach in schools. To understand Vietnam, you have to go back further than most people expect. You have to go back to a world that no longer exists, to the colonial empires of the 19th century, to a small Southeast Asian country that most Europeans couldn't find on a map, and to a young man born in 1890 in the Nha Anh province of central Vietnam whose name, at birth, was Nguyen Sinh Cung. His father was a Confucian scholar, a man of education and quiet dignity in a country where education without French approval meant very little. Vietnam at that time was not really Vietnam. It was part of French Indochina, a colonial territory that France had seized through military force and was now administering through a combination of bureaucratic control and deliberate cultural suppression. The Vietnamese were not citizens. They were subjects. They farmed rice and rubber for French profit. They were prohibited from organizing politically, and they were taught in French-language schools that their own culture was inferior. The boy who would eventually call himself Ho Chi Minh grew up watching this. He watched his father navigate a system designed to humiliate him. He watched his neighbors forced into labor. And somewhere in his childhood, in a particular way that certain experiences shape people irrevocably, he became someone who could not stop thinking about what it would mean to be free. He left Vietnam as a young man and spent years working as a cook, a photo retoucher, a pastry chef in London. He was living, according to accounts from the period, in the margins of the world, present in the great capitals of Europe, but invisible to the people who ran them. And while he was in Paris in 1919, he wrote a petition to the leaders assembled at the Paris Peace Conference following World War I. He asked them, carefully and respectfully, to apply the principle of self-determination to Vietnam, to give his people the basic rights that Woodrow Wilson was declaring were the birthright of all peoples. The petition was ignored. Nobody at the conference was interested in applying democracy to colonial subjects. And that rejection, that specific moment of being seen and dismissed, drove Ho Chi Minh toward the only political movement that was, at that time, actively courting the colonized world: communism. This is a detail that historians emphasize because it matters enormously. Ho Chi Minh did not begin as a communist. He became one in large part because the Democratic West told him he was not worth listening to. Whether or not that makes communism the right answer is a separate question, but it tells you something essential about the logic that built the war that would come. Leave a like on this video if you're finding this context useful, because this background is exactly what American policymakers failed to understand, and that failure cost millions of lives. The French spent the better part of the 19th century building their empire in Southeast Asia, and they spent the 20th century slowly, violently losing it by the time World War II ended. France was a nation recovering from German occupation, desperate to reassert its status as a great power, and determined to hold on to its colonial possessions in Asia. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence in September 1945. He stood in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi and read words drawn from both the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. He was not being ironic. He was, according to observers at the time, genuinely reaching out to the Western democracies. He had reason to hope. The United States had just fought a war against Japanese imperialism. Surely, he believed, America would not support a return to French colonialism. He was wrong. The Truman administration, looking at a world suddenly divided between American capitalism and Soviet communism, made a calculation. France was a critical ally in Europe. Ho Chi Minh had communist ties. And in the binary logic of early Cold War thinking, any communist was an agent of Soviet expansion, regardless of their actual motivations, regardless of their specific history, regardless of the fact that Vietnamese nationalism was a phenomenon with roots going back centuries. The United States began quietly funding the French war effort in Indochina. By 1954, American taxpayers were covering approximately 80% of the cost of France's attempt to reconquer Vietnam. And in the spring of 1954, at a fortress in the northwest of Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu, the entire logic of that investment collapsed. The French had established their garrison at Dien Bien Phu, believing that Viet Minh forces, the Communist Nationalist Army fighting for Ho Chi Minh, could not bring artillery through the surrounding mountains. General Vuong Nguyen Giap, the Viet Minh commander, did something that military historians still discuss with something close to disbelief. He had his soldiers dismantle heavy artillery pieces and carry them by hand through the jungle, over the mountains, and into position overlooking the French base. 56 days later, the French garrison surrendered. France's empire in Asia was finished. The Geneva Accords that followed divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel. The North would be administered by Ho Chi Minh's government. The South would be organized as a separate state. And crucially, the Accords called for national elections in 1956 that would reunify the country under a single government chosen by the Vietnamese people. Those elections were never held. The reason they were never held is one of the most consequential decisions in modern history, and it was made almost casually, buried in diplomatic language, by people who believed they were being strategically sophisticated. President Eisenhower would later write in his memoirs that it was his belief, and the belief of his intelligence services, that if the 1956 elections had been held, Ho Chi Minh would have won approximately 80% of the vote, North and South combined. The Vietnamese people, in other words, wanted reunification under the leader of their independence movement. The United States, rather than accept this outcome, threw its support behind Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist who had spent years in the United States and had powerful American supporters. Diem was installed as the leader of South Vietnam. He canceled the elections. He launched brutal campaigns against political opponents, including not just communists but Buddhist monks, political rivals, and anyone who questioned his authority. He was, by the account of American diplomats stationed in Saigon during that period, a deeply difficult man, brilliant in some ways, paranoid in others, surrounded by family members who were, by multiple accounts, even more ruthless than he was. The United States government knew all of this. The cables from Saigon were not ambiguous. Ambassador after ambassador sent reports back to Washington describing Diem's government as corrupt, incompetent, and increasingly disconnected from the population it was supposed to represent. Washington kept funding him anyway because the alternative, a communist Vietnam unified under Ho Chi Minh, was considered geopolitically unacceptable. This was the era of the domino theory. If Vietnam fell to communism, the thinking went, then Cambodia would fall, then Laos, then Thailand, then all of Southeast Asia. One by one, like dominoes on a table, the theory was compelling as a metaphor, as a description of how actual political systems work. It was, according to scholars who have examined it extensively in the decades since, deeply flawed. But in the early 1960s, in the climate of fear and ideological competition that defined the Cold War, it was essentially the governing logic of American foreign policy in Asia. And into this logic walked John F. Kennedy, a young president who inherited a commitment he had not made in a country he did not fully understand that was already beginning to come apart. Share this video with someone who thinks they know the story of Vietnam, because what comes next is the part that changes how you see everything. By 1963, there were approximately 16,000 American military advisors in Vietnam. They were not officially combat troops. They were there to train the South Vietnamese army, to provide logistical support, to advise. But advisors were dying, and the situation in the South was deteriorating in ways that were impossible to hide from anyone paying close attention. Diem's government was losing the countryside. The National Liberation Front, which American officials called the Viet Cong, was expanding its control over rural South Vietnam with a combination of genuine popular support in some areas and coercion in others. Buddhist monks were setting themselves on fire in the streets of Saigon to protest Diem's repression of their religion. Photographs of those immolations circled the globe. And Diem's sister-in-law, a woman named Tran Le Chien, known as Madame New, who served as a kind of de facto first lady in the Bachelor Diem's government, gave interviews in which she referred to the self-immolations as barbecues. The international reaction was catastrophic. Kennedy was reportedly furious. American officials in Saigon began making contact with South Vietnamese military officers who were considering a coup. The question of how much Kennedy knew and what he authorized has been debated by historians ever since. What is not debated is the outcome. On November 1st, 1963, South Vietnamese military officers launched a coup against Diem. He and his brother were captured and, the following day, murdered in the back of an armored personnel carrier. The State Department cable traffic from that period, declassified decades later, shows American officials expressing shock at the killings. But the cables also show that Washington had been fully aware that a coup was coming and had done nothing to prevent it. 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson inherited Vietnam. And Lyndon Johnson, a man who had built his career on his extraordinary mastery of domestic politics, was now the steward of a war he had profound private doubts about and no idea how to end. The recordings are remarkable. In the Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, there are thousands of hours of telephone calls that Lyndon Johnson secretly recorded. And in those recordings, you can hear the private voice of a president saying things that bear almost no resemblance to what he was saying in public. In February 1964, Johnson called Senator Richard Russell of Georgia his mentor and said, and these are his own words, "I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out." He described Vietnam as the biggest damn mess that I ever saw. He said, "What the hell is Vietnam worth to me? What is it worth to this country?" And then, in August 1964, he used an alleged North Vietnamese attack on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin to push the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution through Congress, a document that gave him effectively unlimited authority to escalate the war without a formal declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. 2 destroyers. 2 alleged attacks. The first attack, on August 2nd, was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats did engage the USS Maddox. The second attack, on August 4th, almost certainly did not happen. The communications intercept that Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara used to convince Congress were, according to subsequent analysis by the National Security Agency's own historians, misread. The sailors on the destroyers themselves reported that night that they may have been firing at radar shadows in rough seas. Johnson knew there were doubts. The cables were not hidden. McNamara flew to the White House with uncertainties that he later acknowledged he chose not to fully convey to Congress or the public. The resolution passed 98-2 in the Senate, and the war began in earnest. Before we get to what the escalation actually looked like on the ground and what it did to the people caught inside it, drop a comment below. I want to know, at this point in the story, do you think Vietnam was a tragic mistake or something more calculated than that? Because the answer affects everything that follows. By 1965, American combat troops were landing in Vietnam. By 1966, there were nearly 400,000 of them. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were deployed in a country smaller than California, fighting an enemy that had been fighting foreign occupiers, the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, the French again, for 1,000 years. The men who arrived in Vietnam were, for the most part, extraordinarily young. The average age of the American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19 years old. 19. Many of them had been drafted, selected by lottery from a population of young American men, separated from their families, given a few months of training, and sent to the other side of the world to fight in a war whose strategic logic was difficult to explain even to the generals running it. What they found when they arrived was unlike any war that America had fought before. There were no front lines. There were no clear objectives that, once taken, meant something decisive had been accomplished. There was jungle so dense that a man could not see 10 feet in front of him, and in that jungle, an enemy that moved at night, that lived underground in tunnel systems that stretched for hundreds of miles, that melted into the civilian population in ways that made the distinction between combatant and non-combatant almost impossible to maintain. The American military strategy, articulated by General William Westmoreland, was one of attrition. The goal was not to take territory. It was to kill enough enemy fighters that the North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong would lose the will to continue fighting. The metric used to measure success was the body count. This created a system with a catastrophic internal logic. Units that reported high body counts received commendations. Pressure flowed down to the chain of command to produce favorable numbers. And in a war where it was often impossible to distinguish between enemy fighters and civilians, the incentives pointed in a direction that produced predictable consequences. William Calley and the My Lai massacre are the most famous of those consequences. On March 16, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment entered the village of My Lai and killed between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians, women, children, elderly men. The killings were systematic. They went on for hours. Officers flew overhead in helicopters. A warrant officer named Hugh Thompson landed his helicopter between the soldiers and the remaining civilians, aimed his weapons at the American troops, and ordered his crew to shoot their fellow soldiers if they continued killing. The Army covered it up for a year. When the story finally broke in November 1969, through the reporting of journalist Seymour Hersh, the American public encountered something they had not been prepared for: the possibility that in trying to win this war, the United States had done things that could not be defended, that could not be explained away, that required looking directly at a moral horror and naming it for what it was. William Calley was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He served 3.5 years under house arrest before being pardoned. But before My Lai, before the massacre became public knowledge, before any of that reckoning began, there was January 1968, and there was a Tet Offensive, and there was a moment when the gap between what the American government had been saying and what was actually true became impossible to paper over. For months, American officials had been projecting confidence. General Westmoreland told Congress in November 1967 that the United States was winning. "We have reached an important point," he said, "when the end begins to come into view." The phrase, "light at the end of the tunnel," had become the unofficial motto of American optimism about the war. On January 30th, 1968, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam. They attacked Saigon. They attacked Hue. A small team of fighters breached the wall of the American Embassy compound in Saigon, an image that was filmed and broadcast into American living rooms within hours. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a failure for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. They suffered catastrophic losses. They did not achieve their stated objectives. The South Vietnamese government did not collapse. The popular uprising they had anticipated did not materialize. But none of that mattered, because what the American public saw was an enemy that had supposedly been on the verge of defeat, launching the largest coordinated offensive of the war. They had been told the war was being won. The images on their televisions told them something different. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in America, traveled to Vietnam after Tet and filed a report that ended with his personal editorial judgment. He said, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." When Lyndon Johnson heard Cronkite's assessment, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." On March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson appeared on television and announced that he would not seek re-election. The war, which he could not end and could not win, had consumed his presidency. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand how history actually works. Not the simplified version, but the real story of decisions and consequences. Because what Nixon did next is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968 on a promise that he had a secret plan to end the war. He never specified what the plan was. The phrase secret plan was, in retrospect, essentially a political device, something that sounded substantive without committing to anything specific. What the record shows, and the record in this case comes from FBI wiretaps, White House tapes, and the research of historians who spent decades examining the declassified evidence, is that Nixon, before he was even elected, made contact with the South Vietnamese government through an intermediary named Anna Chennault. The message delivered to South Vietnam's President Thieu was this: do not agree to the peace negotiations that were underway in Paris. Hold out. Wait for Nixon to win the election. You will get a better deal from a Republican administration. Thieu pulled out of the peace talks. The talks collapsed. The war continued. Lyndon Johnson found out through intelligence intercepts. He described what Nixon had done to trusted advisors as treason. The word he used was treason because it had prolonged the war for political advantage during an election. But Johnson did not make the information public. He was afraid that revealing the existence of the intelligence operation that had captured the communications would cause its own scandal. Nixon won the election. The war continued for 7 more years. The strategy that Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger pursued was called Vietnamization. The idea was to gradually transfer the fighting to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew, to make the war survivable politically in the United States, while maintaining enough military pressure to achieve what they called peace with honor. To create that pressure, Nixon authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country. The bombing was not disclosed to Congress, not disclosed to the American public, and not disclosed even to most of the military commanders involved. It was conducted using falsified records. The planes flew, the bombs fell, and the official documents showed the planes had been somewhere else. The bombing of Cambodia, according to the most careful subsequent estimates, killed between 150,000 and 500,000 Cambodian civilians. It also destabilized the Cambodian government in ways that contributed directly to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, one of the most genocidal regimes of the 20th century, which would go on to kill between 1.5 and 2 million of its own people. While all this was happening, while Nixon was bombing Cambodia in secret, while American soldiers were still dying in Vietnam, while the Pentagon was telling the public that progress was being made, a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg was sitting in offices in Washington reading documents that told a completely different story. Ellsberg had worked for the Rand Corporation and the Defense Department. He had been in Vietnam. He had seen the reality on the ground. And he had access to a classified study that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had commissioned in 1967, a comprehensive, brutally honest internal government study of how the United States had gotten into Vietnam and how it had conducted the war. The study ran to 7,000 pages. It covered administrations going back to Truman. And what it showed again and again was that government officials had known things had known that the situation was worse than they were saying, had known that the strategies weren't working, had known that the public was being given a picture of the war that bore little relationship to reality, and had continued saying what they were saying anyway. In 1971, Ellsberg photocopied the entire study and gave it to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The newspapers published it. The Nixon administration went to federal court to stop them. The Supreme Court ruled against the government. The Pentagon Papers, as they became known, confirmed what many had suspected and what the government had denied. That for decades, for consecutive administrations had systematically misled Congress and the American public about the war in Vietnam. The public's reaction was something that Ellsberg, in interviews given years later, described as simultaneously gratifying and heartbreaking. Gratifying because people finally had access to the truth. Heartbreaking because the truth, once it was public, still did not stop the war. Nixon, meanwhile, was so enraged by the leak that he authorized a special covert unit, nicknamed the Plumbers, to dig up information to discredit Ellsberg and prevent future leaks. The Plumbers broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for damaging information. They later broke into the Watergate complex. And the rest of that story is history of a different kind. By 1973, the United States had signed the Paris Peace Accords and withdrawn its combat troops from Vietnam. Nixon declared that America had achieved peace with honor. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc, though, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, an award so controversial that 2 members of the Nobel Committee resigned in protest. But the peace was not peace. It was a pause. American air power and financial support continued to prop up the South Vietnamese government. North Vietnamese troops remained in South Vietnam. Both sides violated the ceasefire from the beginning, and in April 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive. City after city fell with stunning speed. The South Vietnamese Army, the force that 2 decades of American investment and training had been supposed to turn into a capable military, collapsed. On April 29, 1975, the last Americans were evacuated from Saigon by helicopter. The images of those evacuations, people climbing walls, helicopters being pushed off aircraft carrier decks into the ocean to make room for more, became some of the most iconic and painful photographs of the American century. Ambassador Graham Martin, who had been insisting until almost the last moment that Saigon would not fall, was among the last to leave. He was reportedly close to tears. He carried the American flag that had flown over the embassy. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. A soldier climbed to the top of the building and planted a flag. Vietnam was unified. Ho Chi Minh had died in 1969 and did not live to see it. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Now leave a comment. And I genuinely want to know this. Do you think the United States ever had a realistic path to winning this war? Or was the outcome determined long before the first American combat soldier arrived? Because historians are still arguing about this, and your perspective matters. What happened to the people left behind is a story that deserves its own documentary, and perhaps we will make one. But some of it must be said here. The fall of Saigon was followed by a period that the Vietnamese government called re-education. South Vietnamese military officers, government officials, and others associated with the old regime were sent to camps, in some cases for years, in some cases for decades. The conditions in those camps were brutal by multiple accounts. Families were separated. People who had worked alongside Americans or in the South Vietnamese government disappeared into a system that did not acknowledge their existence. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled by sea in the years following the war. They became known as the Boat People. Their journeys were extraordinarily dangerous. Pirates attacked many of the boats. People drowned. Estimates of the death toll among the Boat People range widely, but the numbers in the hundreds of thousands represent a conservative floor. The United States resettled approximately 130,000 Vietnamese refugees in 1975 alone, and hundreds of thousands more in the years that followed. Many of those families built new lives in America. Many of them still carry the specific grief of people who lost a country. In Vietnam itself, the legacy of the war was written into the landscape in ways that continue to cause suffering decades later. The United States dropped approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides on Vietnam, including Agent Orange, a chemical containing dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known to science. The forests were destroyed, the soil was contaminated, and the dioxin entered the food chain. The consequences are still being borne. Vietnamese children are still being born with birth defects that researchers attribute to dioxin contamination. American veterans exposed to Agent Orange have suffered from cancers, neurological conditions, and other illnesses at elevated rates. Their children have been affected. The veterans fought for decades to receive recognition and medical care from a government that was slow to acknowledge the connection. By 2012, the United States finally began funding a cleanup effort at the former American Air Base at Da Nang, one of the most heavily contaminated sites in Vietnam. The project to clean contaminated soil at Da Nang took years. There are other contaminated sites that have not been cleaned. The American veterans who came home from Vietnam were received in ways that those who came home from World War II would not have recognized. The country was divided. The anti-war movement had been powerful and vocal. The images of the war, the napalm, the body bags, the protests, the killings at Kent State, where National Guard soldiers shot 4 college students dead during an anti-war demonstration, had fractured American society in ways that took decades to begin to heal. Veterans described in interviews and memoirs and congressional testimony given across the years experiences that range from outright hostility to simply not being talked to, a silence that contained within a whole nation's desire to not think about what had happened. Stories of being called names, of having things thrown at them, of being told by employers that their military service was a liability rather than an asset. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a term that did not yet exist when the war was being fought, affected veterans in numbers that the Veterans Administration was not equipped to handle. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans were, according to multiple studies, significantly elevated compared to the general population. The Wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., designed by a 21-year-old architecture student named Mai Lin, was controversial when it was proposed and became, in the years after its dedication in 1982, one of the most visited memorials in the country. People leave things at the wall. Notes, photographs, medals. The things they leave are collected by the National Park Service and archived. They are a record of a grief that never fully ended. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense who oversaw the escalation of the war, who managed the statistics and the strategies and the press conferences, lived until 2009. In 1995, he published a book called In Retrospect, in which he wrote words that many of the families of the 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam found very difficult to read. He wrote that the war had been wrong, that he and his colleagues had been wrong, that they had made mistakes they knew at the time might be mistakes, and had continued anyway. He expressed something that sounded like remorse. The reaction among veterans and Gold Star families was mixed, to say the least. Some felt that an acknowledgement of error, 30 years after the fact, from a man who had suffered nothing and lived comfortably, meant very little. Others found some value in the admission. McNamara, in interviews given in the final years of his life, acknowledged that he did not know what to do with his own guilt. He said that some things could not be made right, only acknowledged. Henry Kissinger, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, who authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia, who helped negotiate the Paris Peace Accords, and who continued to operate in corridors of power and international consulting for decades after, died in November 2023 at the age of 100. He was eulogized by world leaders. He was also, in the final years of his life, the subject of calls from international human rights lawyers for investigation into what they characterized as war crimes. Both things were true simultaneously. That is often how history works. If you've made it this far, and the fact that you have tells me something about the kind of person you are, share this video. Not because the algorithm rewards it, though it does, but because this story deserves to be understood by more people than it currently is. What is the lesson of Vietnam? This is a question that American policymakers, military strategists, historians, and philosophers have been asking for 50 years, and they have not reached agreement. Some argue that the lesson is about military strategy, that the United States fought the wrong kind of war, with the wrong metrics of success, without understanding the nature of guerrilla conflict and the importance of political legitimacy. Some argue that the lesson is about credibility, that the United States paid an enormous price in lives and treasure and international standing to demonstrate that it would honor its commitments, even when those commitments were poorly conceived. Some argue that the lesson is about political systems, that a democracy cannot sustain an unpopular war indefinitely, that the relationship between the government and the governed imposes limits on what military power can accomplish. And some, particularly those who lost family members on both sides, argue that the lesson is simpler and more terrible than any of those formulations, that the war should not have happened, that the 1956 elections should have been held, that Ho Chi Minh, whatever his flaws and his communist ideology, represented something real about Vietnamese nationalism that a superpower's strategic calculations could not simply overwrite, that the domino theory was wrong, that the millions of dead Vietnamese and American and Cambodian and Laotian died not for a cause but for a mistake maintained by pride. The domino theory, as a historical matter, turned out to be largely wrong. Vietnam became a communist country. The dominoes did not fall the way they were supposed to fall. Thailand did not become communist. Indonesia did not become communist. The predicted cascade did not materialize. The world did not change in a way that the architects of the policy said it would change if America did not fight. This does not mean that the people who held the domino theory were fools or villains. They were operating in a world of genuine uncertainty, genuine fear, genuine ideological conflict. Some of them believed deeply in what they were doing, but believing deeply in something does not make it true. And the gap between their certainty and the actual outcome of history is a gap that 58,000 American names on a wall in Washington, and 2 million Vietnamese civilian dead, and tens of thousands of veterans who came home broken were made to fill. There is a final detail that is worth knowing, because it says something about the nature of the whole story. In 1967, at the height of the war, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a study that would eventually become the Pentagon Papers. He did so because he wanted an honest account of how the United States had gotten into Vietnam, an internal reckoning, documented and preserved, that would exist for history. What the study found in 7,000 pages of classified analysis was that the decision-makers had known again and again at turning point after turning point that the strategies were not working, that the situation was worse than the public statement suggested, that the path forward was not clear, and had continued anyway. McNamara commissioned the study. He read the study, and he did not change policy. He did not resign. He did not tell Congress or the public what the study contained. He left the Defense Department in 1968, took a position as president of the World Bank, and the study sat in classified files until Daniel Ellsberg made it public 4 years later. The study was not suppressed out of malice. Exactly. It was suppressed out of something more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. The belief that the truth was too dangerous to release, that the system could not absorb the shock, that the costs of honesty were greater than the costs of continued deception. That calculation, that the truth is too dangerous, that the public cannot be trusted with what the government knows, that the management of perception is more important than the management of reality, is not unique to Vietnam. It appears in the history of every major political crisis of the 20th century, and it is arguably the deepest lesson that Vietnam has to teach. Not about military strategy, not about the limits of power, but about the relationship between truth and institutions, about what happens when the people entrusted with the information that affects millions of lives decide that those millions of lives do not need to know. The girl in the photograph, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, survived her burns after receiving treatment for over a year. She went on to live in Cuba, where the Vietnamese government sent her for public relations purposes, wanting to use her image for political messaging. She eventually defected to Canada while her plane refueled in Gander, Newfoundland in 1992. She became a Canadian citizen. She founded a foundation to help child victims of war. In 1996, she spoke at a Veterans Day ceremony at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. She stood before the wall with the names on it and said that if she could talk to the man who ordered the airstrike that burned her, she would tell him she forgave him. She said she could not change history, but she could try to do good with what remained. The photographer who took the image, Nick Ut, an Associated Press photographer who was himself Vietnamese, drove her to a hospital after taking the picture. He visited her in the hospital. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. The photograph won the Pulitzer Prize. The war did not end lasted 3 more years. The last American combat soldiers left Vietnam in March 1973. The last American to die in the Vietnam War, a Marine named Darwin Judge, was killed on April 29, 1975, the same day as the Saigon evacuation. He was 19 years old. He appears on the wall in Washington. His name is there with the others. 58,000 names on a black granite surface that reflects the faces of the people who come to read them. The wall does not explain anything. It does not offer justification or condemnation. It is just the names. And somehow that is more powerful than any explanation, because in the end, that is what remains when the geopolitical calculations are over, when the strategists have moved on to the next crisis, when the leaders who made the decisions have given their memoirs and received their honors and died in their beds. The names, the lives that were actually lived and actually ended, the families that were actually broken, the country that was actually burned. Power protected the people who made the decisions in Vietnam for decades. In some cases, it protected them for the rest of their lives. But it could not protect them from the judgment of history. And it could not protect the people beneath them from the consequences of what they chose. Vietnam is not an old story. It is a present one. The questions it raises about honesty, about accountability, about who gets to decide what is worth dying for, and who bears the cost of those decisions. Those questions are not resolved. They recur. They will recur again. And the only defense against repeating what happened is understanding, fully and without comfort, what actually took place.